In 1898, Émile Zola made a decision that French authorities would spend decades trying to erase. He walked into the offices of the Paris Daily L'Aurore and wrote a single, enormous open letter to the President of the Republic. The headline read, "J'accuse." The body named names: the Minister of War, the generals who had hidden a secret dossier, the judges who had sentenced an officer without evidence. The column was printed on January 13, 1898. It shattered polite society. It put the Republic on trial. To understand how explosive that line was, one must go back to 1894. On October 15th, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer at the École Polytechnique, was arrested at the Invalides in Paris on a charge of passing military secrets to the German embassy. The prosecution relied on a torn-up memorandum, thèse bordereau, and a set of handwriting comparisons. On December 22, 1894, a military court in Rennes found Dreyfus guilty of treason. He was stripped of his rank in a public degradation ceremony and shipped to Devil's Island in Cayenne, French Guiana. The verdict and the spectacle fed a France already raw from the Franco-Prussian defeat of 1870, full of revanchism and a rising tide of antisemitism. France in the 1890s was a nation still haunted by defeat. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany had become more than a military humiliation. It was a national obsession. Politicians promised revenge. Newspapers fueled suspicion of foreign spies. Military officers were treated as guardians of national honor, and questioning their judgment was often seen as questioning France itself. In that atmosphere, fear could easily outweigh evidence, and public opinion was willing to believe almost any accusation that appeared to protect the nation. Not everyone accepted the verdict. In 1896, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, appointed head of the Army's statistical section, discovered what the Army preferred not to look at: documents and handwriting that pointed away from Dreyfus and toward another officer, Major Ferdinand Esterhazy. Picquart reported what he found. He was sidelined. He was sent to Tunisia in what contemporaries called exile. The Army closed ranks. A secret dossier was assembled that the defense was never allowed to read. Behind closed doors, military officials insisted that revealing classified evidence would threaten national security. Instead of presenting the complete case in open court, they relied on documents that neither Dreyfus nor his lawyers were allowed to examine. To many citizens, secrecy sounded patriotic, but to others, it marked the moment justice began giving way to institutional self-preservation. The case was becoming less about one officer and more about whether any government should be trusted without scrutiny. Evidence was suppressed. Lies were polished. The state protected itself. Then Zola decided to speak. Zola understood exactly what he was risking. He was one of France's most celebrated writers, with international recognition and financial security. Publishing an accusation against the government could destroy his reputation, his career, and even his freedom. Yet he believed silence carried a greater cost. If influential voices refused to challenge injustice, he argued, then ordinary citizens would have little hope of ever seeing the truth emerge. He had been a novelist, not a lawyer. He had written Rougon-Macquart and condemned social corruption in fiction. On that January morning, he put his name under a public accusation and demanded a reckoning. The piece was not literary gentleness. It was a prosecutor's brief in print. It demanded that France choose between honor and expediency. The Republic answered with guns and courts. But what investigators found next would change everything. Exposed by Picquart's persistence and by journalists who pursued the paper trails, the scandal widened. Major Hubert Joseph Henry, an Army intelligence officer, forged documents to shore up the case against Dreyfus. According to court records and later testimony, Henry manufactured a fake confession and planted it among the files. When the forgeries were exposed, Henry reportedly confessed and shot himself in custody. His death was both confession and calamity. The revelation proved that the army had not merely erred, it had conspired. The discovery shocked even people who had never supported Dreyfus. A forged document meant the scandal was no longer about mistaken handwriting analysis or flawed military intelligence. It suggested that officials had deliberately manufactured evidence to preserve their authority. Across Europe, newspapers began covering the affair as a warning about how easily power could manipulate justice when accountability disappeared. The turning point crystallized when the army's own trial of Esterhazy failed to quiet the crowd. The military court cleared Esterhazy, a verdict that many contemporaries saw as a cover-up. Street fights followed. The conflict escaped the courtroom and spilled into everyday life. Families argued across dinner tables. University students organized demonstrations. Cafes became political battlegrounds, where friendships ended over a single opinion about Dreyfus. The affair had transformed from a criminal case into a struggle over the identity of the French Republic itself. Newspapers split France into camps that called themselves Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. Émile Zola was charged with criminal libel. He was convicted and fled to England to avoid prison. Newspapers were censored. Political leaders stoked nationalist fury. Synagogues were attacked. The scandal hollowed the trust citizens had in Republican institutions. The immediate fallout was bitter and public. Émile Zola's life was upended. He lived in exile in London for months. Alfred Dreyfus remained on Devil's Island, enduring isolation and brutality. The army's reputation lay in tatters, and portions of the French press were exposed as instruments of nationalist agitation. Some officers were quietly punished. Others were protected. Official files were sealed. Years later, historians would continue examining military archives, personal letters, and government records to reconstruct what had happened. Every newly uncovered document reinforced a troubling lesson. The greatest danger was not a single wrongful conviction, but the willingness of respected institutions to protect themselves long after the truth had become undeniable. Histories were rewritten with omissions. The affair did not end in a single courtroom or a single year. It planted seeds that would sprout long after 1900. An emboldened press, new legal standards about evidence, and political movements that drew strength from the way a state could bend truth. It also changed individuals. Colonel Picquart would return from exile, promoted and vindicated by later tribunals. Theodor Herzl cited the affair in writing The Jewish State. Today, the Dreyfus affair is remembered as one of history's defining examples of investigative journalism confronting state power. Law schools, historians, and journalists continue to study the case, not because it belongs to the past, but because its central question remains painfully relevant. How should democracies respond when the institutions entrusted to defend justice become the very institutions accused of undermining it? And yet, the most unsettling fact is plain. A single public letter, written in cold ink and published in a Parisian paper, forced a nation to reveal what it preferred to hide. The question that lingers is not who was guilty in that shabby room in Rennes in 1894, but how many institutions, in defense of themselves, will ever choose truth over survival when the two are finally at odds.